Welcome. My name is Nevan. I'm an amateur climatologist of the state of Florida, and during this presentation we will be reviewing and discussing the associated impacts of climate change on human welfare, the U.S. economy, the African economy, and the global economy. So, it's a lot to cover, so let's begin. First, let's break down climate change and its definition. Climate change is the shift in normal weather patterns in a region's climate. Weather patterns are the current meteorological conditions occurring annually. So if we take 30 of those annual weather patterns, squish them into one, that's a climate pattern. And if we look at climate patterns, there's quite a drastic difference between those periods. And we can see that occurring now. The globe is experiencing an increase in global temperature because of greenhouse effects. Essentially what's happening is large molecules in the atmosphere are collecting heat and radiating it back down to Earth, increasing the temperature. So with that increased temperature, it's going to be pretty uncomfortable, so we're going to discuss heat-related illnesses and death associated with increasing global temperatures. Pandemics and vector-borne diseases are also on the rise, so we'll discuss that, as well as the potential for human migrations away from areas that are experiencing high impacts of climate change. Looking at the economies, U.S. economy is going to experience, especially along the coast, rises in insurance premiums, taxes, and the African countries are going to experience devastating water shortages and scarcity, as well as the inability to adapt to climate change. Looking at the global economy, inflation is going to be on the rise, slowing economic growth, and we are going to see the inequality within developing nations widen and increase. And so we might see a little bit more aid from developed nations towards developing nations for fighting climate change. So to begin with impacts on human welfare, heat-related illnesses and death, the individuals that are at most risk for that are going to be outdoor workers without AC, younger and older populations, athletes, the homeless population, those with medical conditions, as well as if you look at figure 1, there is a high peak in temperature around the commercial, downtown, and urban residential areas. Those are known as urban heat islands and are kind of dangerous if you don't pay attention. And we might see a little bit more mortality rates in those areas, especially within this next century by 2100, potentially 18 deaths per 100,000 people, and that's just along nearly 50 cities along the eastern U.S. Looking at the pandemics, that are increasing. I mean, just this last year, the COVID-19 pandemic, the populations that are going to be at most risk for that are going to be, right now it's currently mid-latitude regions, so tropical, subtropical, but pandemics and these pathogens and vector-borne diseases, which are diseases transmitted from mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas, stuff like that, the increasing temperatures are allowing their range to go further. They're trekking into northern latitudes, into temperate latitudes. So that's kind of dangerous for northern countries like the U.S. and a lot of Europe. So what we need to do in order to prepare for this, we need to develop country vulnerability assessments, and should be compiled towards the potential risks that are involved with these possible pandemics and preventing the economic disruption that's going to be delivered from those. And finally, looking at human population migration as a result of climate change impacts. It's going to, again, developing regions around the mid-latitude of Earth are going to be experiencing a lot of the most impacts from that. However, it's difficult to look into the future for these migrations. It's difficult to understand and predict human behavior, which is going to be the leading factor for migration, right? So, looking in the past, looking in throughout history, we can look at natural disaster events and pick out the statistics and compare them to determine the highest rates of displacement, the permanent, the short-term relocations that occur, and kind of account for that and predict it through that way. In order to prevent a lot of migration, we could have socio-demographic households specifically aided to adapt towards the changing climates. Jumping over to the economy, we're going to look at the U.S. economy first, especially along the coast. If you see those highlighted numbers there, that's over $400 billion on federal disaster aid and redevelopment. So when I say redevelopment, that means that a lot of these homes are insured. These owners are paying insurance premiums to help insurance companies, and if need be, the federal government, aid them to rebuild their house. The issue is, these are high-risk climate areas. They're rebuilding their houses on sand that's constantly eroding, that's constantly being hit by hurricanes. This is just $400 billion in the past 2 decades. And when we're seeing that, a huge increase in federal aid disaster budgets, where taxpayers are now paying over 70, nearly sometimes 100% of redevelopment costs. So what we need to look at in these areas along the East Coast, along the Gulf Coast, these are high-impact areas of climate change. They're always getting hit by hurricanes, so we're going to have to increase the insurance premiums to actually match that risk potential. So if the potential of a flood is, say, $400, we're going to have to almost meet that $400 budget so that the insurance coverage, or the insurance companies, can try to cover those aids or those disasters. And alternatively, we could have no insurance in those areas, and it's up to the owner to assume the risk. If you're going to rebuild, you're going to have to do it at your own risk. Looking at Africa now, in those countries, we're going to see a lot of contributing factors towards water shortage impacts, being that a lot of those countries are poverty-stricken developing nations. They don't have their preparedness response, the government preparedness response in order to do this. Their government hasn't set up any infrastructure in order to be better prepared for the scarcity, deeper wells, or more policies on water collection. The other issue is that a lot of these countries heavily dependent on fossil fuels. They're just digging themselves into a deeper hole here. And a lot of these countries are acting reactively rather than preemptively, spending money towards fixing rather than protecting. So in future years, we could see conflicts from the frustrations of the actual water scarcity, as well as the inaction of policymakers and policies, and this is going to increase the inequality gap definitely throughout these countries. Speaking of that, Africa's economy overall is going to experience about 15% loss of gross domestic product. That's huge. It's going to potentially freeze economic growth. They don't have the capital. African countries don't really have the capital in order to set up the mitigation or adaptation efforts in order to fight off climate change. So what we need to kind of pursue here is encourage African leaders and policymakers to follow mitigation ambition, pretty much following the standards of the Paris Agreement, making sure the increasing global temperatures don't surpass that 2 °C threshold. Developed nations are going to have to kind of come in and start helping developing nations to save lives here, mitigation efforts, you know? So climate risk assessments and climate-related finance are going to be definite incentives for future protection and mitigation towards climate change impacts. All right, stepping back, looking at the entire globe, this is going to be a hypothetical. If we don't do anything, if there's nothing towards the fighting of climate change, in the next 25 years, the global domestic product could drop by 20%, affecting the top 50 countries of the world. Asia is going to be experiencing nearly 25% loss, US 10, Europe 11, and this is all going to be devastating towards communities. The inflation is going to skyrocket as shortages increase throughout different resources. But good news, if we start enforcing mitigations, we start helping out these developing countries, and we stay below that 2 degrees Celsius increase, we might only experience a loss of about 4%. Keep that in mind. The inequality is definitely increasing between higher latitude developed nations and lower latitude developing nations. You can actually see there's a country mean temperature of empirical optimum that is a comfortable threshold for these upper latitude countries, they're increasing their economic growth right now, while these countries you can see in Figure 2 and C and D, those red swatches, those are countries that are experiencing decreasing economic growth, increasing disparity and inequality. So it's going to be one of the greatest indirect impacts that we'll see in the next few decades. Finally, looking at all of this, since we're trying to figure out how much it's kind of going to cost in order to foot the whole bill in order for global mitigation, essentially, we could expect around a 1% cost of the global gross domestic product per year to cover those costs. And that's also including the developing countries that are forcing to adapt to these impacts without the actual resources, and further polluting the environment with their resources that they're still dependent on. So these developed nations, UK, the US, need to step up and help support these developing countries to integrate climate change mitigation. So key takeaways: it's going to be greatly affecting mid-latitudes, developing countries. We have to step up. We have to take in arms the rest of our international brethren to help support these vulnerable populations through policy action that's best done now. We have to do it now. It's not going to be able to be mitigated in the future if we're not mitigating it now. Thank you, and onward.